The stranger in seat 22B's plane was already boarding when Sundar Pichai arrived at the gate. He wore a simple blue sweater, black jeans, and carried only a small backpack. Nobody seemed to notice him. A few people brushed past, focused on their phones, while a gate agent barely looked up before scanning his boarding pass. Inside the plane, he walked quietly down the narrow aisle. Row after row of tired faces, some impatient, some half asleep. He passed business class without even glancing. At the wide leather seats, he kept walking. Finally, he stopped at row 22. He slid into the middle seat 22B between a young woman by the window and a man in a dark jacket on the aisle. The woman in 22 smiled politely, then turned back to the clouds outside. The man in 22C, however, stared at Sundar as if trying to figure him out. Sundar nodded and said softly, "Excuse me," as he placed his backpack under the seat. The plane's engines roared to life. Sundar closed his eyes and let himself feel the hum of the cabin. But after a few minutes, he noticed the man beside him was still staring. "You look familiar," the man finally said. His voice was low, cautious. Sundar smiled faintly and replied, "People say that sometimes." But the man wasn't satisfied. He leaned closer. "You're Sundar Pichai, aren't you? Google guy." Sundar opened his eyes. He looked at the man for a long second, then nodded. Yes, there was a silence. The man sat back, blinking as though he'd just discovered a secret treasure. Then he chuckled bitterly. "You're sitting here, in Economy," Sundar shrugged. "I like being here. Reminds me of things I shouldn't forget." The man laughed again, but there was no joy in it. "You're saying that like it's easy. I bet you don't know what it's like back here. Anymore, not really." Sundar turned to face him fully. "You'd be surprised." The man narrowed his eyes. His tone grew sharper. "Do you really believe you can understand? I just lost my job last week. My son is sick. My rent is overdue. And you sit here and tell me you like it." The woman at the window shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet. Sundar didn't flinch. He let the man's anger fill the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but heavy. "I grew up not far from here. A two-room house. No hot water. No fridge. Some nights we couldn't afford to eat. And yes, I like sitting here because it reminds me of that. It reminds me of how far I still have to go." The man blinked, surprised. His mouth opened as though he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. The plane lurched suddenly. Turbulence. A few gasps rippled through the cabin as the fasten seatbelt sign dinged. Sundar closed his eyes again, but the man kept staring. "You don't get it," the man muttered. "You don't know how it feels to fail." Sundar opened his eyes slowly. This time, there was something dark and quiet behind them. "I do," he said, "more than you think." The man stared at him. The woman by the window finally looked over, curious now. But before Sundar could explain, the overhead speaker crackled. A tense voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a minor technical issue. We'll be circling for a while before landing. Please remain calm." The man in 22C swore under his breath. "Of course, just my luck." But Sundar didn't move. Instead, he leaned closer and said, very softly, "Sometimes, circling is exactly what you need to see the whole picture." The man stared at him, confused, even irritated. But before he could reply, a flight attendant hurried down the aisle and stopped right at their row. She bent down and whispered something in Sundar's ear. His face changed just slightly, and for the first time, he looked worried. Then, he stood up without a word, grabbed his backpack, and followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane. The man and the woman both watched him go. The man's brow furrowed. "What was that about?" he muttered. But Sundar didn't look back, as he disappeared through the curtain into the front cabin. The man in 22C felt something strange in his chest, like a question he didn't know how to ask yet. And for the rest of the flight, he couldn't stop thinking about the quiet billionaire who chose to sit in economy, and what secret he might be hiding. The message in the envelopeth plane had been quiet for several minutes. After Sundar disappeared behind the curtain, the man in 22C sat stiffly, staring at the empty middle seat beside him, as though it might suddenly explain itself. The woman at the window, who had been pretending not to listen, finally turned to him with a hesitant glance. "Was that really him?" she asked in a whisper, her eyes wide. The man nodded, though doubt still lingered in his own mind. "Yeah," he murmured, almost to himself. That was Sundar Pichai. He felt the name on his tongue like a question, like a challenge, like something too big to belong in this cramped economy cabin. Outside the window, the sky was starting to darken. Streaks of gold and purple fell over the clouds. But inside the plane, the air seemed heavier, as if the whole cabin was holding its breath. He tried to shake off the encounter, tried to tell himself it didn't matter. But the more he thought about Sundar's quiet eyes, the more it unsettled him. He leaned back in his seat and closed his own eyes, willing himself to sleep. Yet just as he began to drift, he felt a faint tap on his shoulder. He opened his eyes to find the same flight attendant standing over him, her expression tight, unreadable. She held out a small cream-colored envelope with his name scrawled across the front. He blinked at it, confused. For me, he asked at the flight attendant, gave a single curt nod, then quickly moved on down the aisle without another word. The man stared at the envelope in his hands. The paper felt thick, expensive. His own name, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, stared back at him. His pulse quickened. He glanced around, but nobody else seemed to notice. Even the woman beside him had turned her gaze back to the darkening sky outside. Slowly, almost afraid of what he might find. He opened it. Inside was a single folded note. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. The words were short but heavy. You said, I don't know what it feels like to fail. You're wrong. When the plane lands, meet me outside gate 27. I have something to show you. He read the note 3 times. His heart thudding louder with each reading. The handwriting was the same. Calm, controlled, unmistakably Sundar's. He looked toward the curtain at the front of the cabin, but it remained closed. No sign of him. The man stuffed the note back into the envelope and shoved it into his jacket pocket, but he couldn't sit still anymore. He kept shifting in his seat, drumming his fingers on the armrest, his mind racing. He thought about the way Sundar had looked at him earlier, not with pity, but with something else, something more complicated. He thought about what he himself had said about losing his job, his sick son, the rent he couldn't pay, and wondered if maybe he had misjudged. The man beside him, the woman at the window, glanced at him again. This time her eyes were softer. Everything okay? She asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he said, though his voice cracked on the word. But everything was not okay. He sat there in silence as the plane continued to circle in the sky, his thoughts a storm of questions. What did Sundar mean? What did he want to show him? And why him, of all people? Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, saying they would begin their descent soon. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Passengers around him started packing up their things, chatting nervously about their delays. But he couldn't move. His fingers brushed the envelope in his pocket over and over, like it was a live wire. The plane landed hard on the runway, jolting everyone forward. The passengers burst into applause, a ritual of relief. The engines quieted. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Everyone stood, pulling down their bags, eager to leave, but the man stayed in his seat, watching the curtain at the front. It never moved. Sundar didn't reappear. Soon, the aisle was clogged with people shuffling toward the exit. The woman at the window gave him a small, curious smile before slipping past him and disappearing into the crowd. Finally, he rose. He grabbed his worn backpack from under the seat and stepped into the line of passengers inching toward the door. As he walked down the jet bridge, his chest felt tight. His hands were sweaty. The note burned in his pocket. Outside the gate, the terminal was buzzing with tired travelers and the smell of stale coffee. He scanned the signs overhead, searching. There it was, gate 27. He started walking, each step heavier than the last. When he finally arrived, the gate was empty, except for a janitor pushing a mop. No Sundar. He glanced around, suddenly nervous. Had he misunderstood? Was this some kind of cruel joke? Then he heard a voice behind him. You came. He spun around. There was Sundar standing a few feet away, leaning casually against a pillar. His backpack slung over one shoulder. But this time, his expression was different. No faint smile, no calm eyes. Instead, he looked almost haunted. He motioned for the man to follow him. The man hesitated. Where are we going? He asked, his voice breaking the thick silence. Sundar's answer was quiet but clear. To the place where I failed the most, he said, and where I learned the only thing that ever mattered. Then, without waiting, he turned and started walking toward a darkened corridor at the end of the terminal. The man stood frozen for a second, heart hammering, staring after him. Then he swallowed hard, tightened his grip on his backpack, and followed Sundar into the shadows. The shadows of the past corridor Sundar led him down was narrow, dim, and quiet. The polished tile of the terminal gave way to plain concrete beneath their feet. Faint humming sounds came from somewhere behind the walls. Machines, maybe, or just the hidden veins of the airport. Overhead, a single line of flickering fluorescent lights stretched endlessly. The man followed closely, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his breaths coming faster now. He kept glancing at Sundar's back, tall, steady, but somehow heavier than before. Gone was the quiet man from seat 22 billion, who spoke softly about remembering where he came from. Now Sundar's movements seemed sharp, determined, almost angry. They passed an unmarked metal door. Then another. The air grew cooler, almost damp. Finally, Sundar stopped. He stood before a door painted the color of ash, its surface chipped and worn. Without turning, he said, "This is where it started." The man swallowed hard. Started, what? Sundar placed a hand on the door but didn't open it yet. Instead, he spoke slowly, as though each word weighed more than he could carry. This was the first place I failed so completely I thought I'd never stand up again. And it was the first place someone showed me kindness when I least deserved it. The man furrowed his brow, confused, but also strangely moved. He wanted to ask what Sundar meant, but the words wouldn't come. With a faint creak, Sundar pushed open the door. Inside was a small windowless room. The walls were bare, painted a pale gray that had faded into yellow in places. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. A single wooden table stood in the middle, with two metal chairs on either side. A harsh light bulb dangled above it, swaying slightly, casting long shadows across the floor. Sundar stepped in and motioned for the man to sit. They both lowered themselves into the cold metal chairs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sundar reached into his backpack and pulled out a thin folder. Its edges were frayed, and it looked like it had been handled many times before. He slid it across the table. The man hesitated, then opened it. Inside were a few sheets of paper and an old photograph. The photo showed a much younger Sundar, perhaps in his early 20s, sitting at a desk in a room that looked a lot like this one. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn. He looked defeated. "What is this?" the man asked quietly. Sundar's voice was soft but steady. "This was taken the day I was rejected from my first job interview. The day I realized I was not as smart as I thought. The day I learned humility the hard way." The man looked at the paper's faded rejection letters, notes scrawled in angry handwriting, and a sheet that simply read in bold letters, "Unsuitable, lacks potential." He shook his head in disbelief. "They said you lacked potential." Sundar let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh yes, more than once. This room was where they told me I'd never amount to much. They even made me sit here for hours before giving me the news. I sat right where you are now. I remember every minute of it." The man felt a knot in his throat. "But you didn't give up." Sundar looked him straight in the eyes, and for the first time, there was fire in them. "No," he said, "but it was not because I was brave. It was because of someone else." The man leaned in, intrigued despite himself. Sundar continued. "After they told me I failed, everyone left. I stayed in this room, too ashamed to go outside. Then a janitor, an old man with crooked hands, came in to clean. He saw me sitting there, broken, and he stopped. He sat down across from me and said, 'Son, you can either let this define you, or you can define yourself.'" The man felt his chest tighten. Sundar's voice softened even more. He didn't know me. He had no reason to care. But he stayed with me that night until I could stand up again. He gave me the courage to walk out of here and try again. And every time I wanted to quit after that, I remembered his words. The room was quiet now, except for the faint buzzing of the light bulb overhead. The man ran his fingers over the rejection letters in front of him. He thought about his own failures, losing his job, his sick son, his unpaid rent, and wondered if maybe he'd been looking at them all wrong. Finally, he looked up at Sundar. Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Sundar leaned back in his chair. His eyes, though still intense, were filled with something softer now. "Because," he said slowly, "you reminded me of myself. Angry, scared, convinced that failure meant the end of the road. But it doesn't, and you needed to see that for yourself." The man stared at him, speechless. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Both of them turned. The door opened slightly, and a young woman in a black uniform poked her head in. "Sir," she said, her eyes on Sundar. "It's time." Sundar gave her a brief nod. She disappeared as quickly as she'd come. He stood, slipping the folder back into his backpack. But before he left, he turned to the man and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let this be the end of your story," he said quietly. "The next chapter depends on what you decide to believe about yourself." Then he walked out, leaving the man alone in the gray room surrounded by silence and shadows. The man sat there for a long time, staring at the door through which Sundar had just disappeared. In his pocket, the envelope still felt warm. In his mind, the words still echoed. And in his chest, for the first time in months, there was the faintest spark of something he thought he'd lost forever, hope. But just as he stood to leave, he noticed something strange on the table. There was another envelope, and this one had no name on it at all. His hands trembled as he reached for it, already knowing that whatever was inside would change everything once again. The envelope with no name. Man stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. It lay there, in the middle of the cold metal table, pale and silent, as though it had been waiting for him all along. It was identical to the first, same cream-colored paper, same delicate weight, but this one carried no name, no mark, nothing to suggest who it was meant for. His fingers hovered above it, trembling slightly. Part of him wanted to leave it there, to walk out of the gray room and never look back. But another part, the part that had followed Sundar into this place, whispered that this was not a mistake, that this was for him, even if it didn't say so. Slowly, he picked it up. The paper felt warm against his skin, as though it carried some strange quiet energy. He turned it over, half expecting to see a message appear in invisible ink. But it remained blank. He broke the seal and carefully slid out a single folded sheet of paper. It was thicker than the last note, and when he opened it, he saw that this one was longer. He began to read. "If you are reading this, it means you chose to follow your curiosity rather than your fear. That already makes you different from who you were when you sat down in seat 2 to see. This envelope has no name because it does not belong to just one person. It belongs to anyone who finds themselves here, angry, lost, broken, and still decides to open it. I am writing to you now because there are things I could not say to you face, because some truths are heavier than even I know how to carry aloud. Years ago, in this very room, I decided to end my dream. I told myself that failure was proof that I was not meant to succeed. I planned to walk away and never try again. But I was wrong. What I did not know then was that failure was the price of something greater. What felt like an end was only the beginning. I was rescued not by success, but by kindness. By a stranger who reminded me that even when I had nothing, I still had a choice. The man stopped reading for a moment. He exhaled slowly and let the words sink into him. He thought about Sundar's quiet determination. He thought about his own son's small, fragile body in the hospital bed. He thought about the way he had begun to believe he was a failure too. Eyes drifted back to the page. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your story, know this. You are not finished yet, and you are not alone. Leave this room and do one thing, just one small thing, to move forward. Even if no one notices, even if no one believes in you yet. Because someday, someone will sit here where you are sitting now, and they will need you to remind them what I am reminding you, that you are not defined by what they said you couldn't do. The word stopped there, but at the bottom of the page, written in smaller handwriting, there was a final line. When you are ready, return this envelope to the table. Someone else will need it after you. His hands trembled as he folded the paper back into the envelope. He looked around the room at the bare walls, at the faint scratches in the table's surface, at the single flickering light, and felt something shift inside of him. He placed the envelope back in the center of the table, exactly as he had found it. Then he stood. Outside the room, the corridor was still dim and quiet, but somehow it felt different now. Each step he took toward the brighter part of the terminal felt lighter, though his chest still ached with something he couldn't yet name. When he emerged into the main terminal, crowds of travelers flowed past him in every direction, laughing, shouting, dragging suitcases, clutching coffee cups, but he only had eyes for one figure. Sundar was there, standing near the windows. His backpack still slung over one shoulder, his posture calm but alert, as though he had been waiting the whole time. Their eyes met. The man walked over, slow at first, then faster. When he reached Sundar, neither of them spoke for a long moment. They just stood there, facing each other, two strangers who somehow felt less like strangers now. Finally, the man found his voice. It cracked, but he didn't care. Why me? He asked. Why did you choose me? Sundar's expression softened. Because, he said quietly, you chose yourself the moment you opened that envelope. The man swallowed hard. I don't know what to do now, he admitted. Sundar gave the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. Start small, he said. It's not about knowing the whole path. It's about taking the next step. The man nodded, though his chest was tight and his hands still shook. Just then, an announcement crackled over the loudspeakers. Boarding call for another flight. Sundar glanced at his watch. I have to go, he said, his voice softer now. But you'll be fine, you'll see. He extended his hand, and the man shook it. Then Sundar turned and began walking toward the gate. The man watched him disappear into the crowd, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it finally slipped out of sight. The man stood there for a long time, feeling the envelope's words echo in his mind. But just as he began to turn back, toward the exit, he felt the tap on his shoulder. He spun around, startled. Behind him stood the janitor, a thin, older man with crooked hands, the same man from Sundar's story. He was holding a small envelope. And he was smiling. The man with crooked hands janitor stood there silently, his crooked fingers clutching the envelope like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. But nothing about this moment felt ordinary. The man in two, to see who now felt like someone entirely different from the one who boarded the plane, stared at him, heart hammering against his ribs. Breath caught somewhere between fear and awe. The janitor's hands were thin, the knuckles twisted, the skin stretched over bones like worn parchment, but his eyes were sharp and kind at the same time, as though they had seen everything and forgiven most of it. His uniform was faded, the name tag too scratched to read. And yet, standing here now, he seemed to take up the entire space around him, as though even the crowds weaving through the terminal unconsciously gave him room. The man swallowed hard, his voice breaking the silence. You're the one, he whispered. You're the one Sundar talked about, the one who stayed with him that night. The janitor tilted his head slightly, his smile gentle but unreadable. And you, the janitor said, his voice low and rough but warm, are the one he stayed with tonight. The words sank into him like stones into water. The janitor held out the envelope. It was heavier than the others had been, its edges frayed with age. There was no name written on it this time either, but there was something faint stamped into the paper, a symbol the man couldn't quite make out, like a circle broken by a single line. What is this? The man asked, his throat dry. Janitor's eyes glinted in the harsh terminal light. This, he said simply, is the choice. The man's fingers closed around the envelope. Its weight startled him. It felt almost alive, like it carried more than paper inside. He wanted to open it right there, but the janitor shook his head slowly. Not here, the janitor murmured. There's a place for this. He turned and began walking, and though his gait was slow and his frame fragile, he moved with certainty. Without thinking, the man followed. They walked through the terminal, past families laughing over fast food trays, past businessmen murmuring into phones, past weary travelers sprawled across their luggage. Every few steps, the man glanced at the envelope in his hands, the paper warm against his palm. Eventually, they reached a part of the airport he hadn't seen before, a quiet corner where the air seemed cooler. The noise of the crowd faded. Here the janitor stopped in front of a door marked only by a single brass plate. The plate bore no words, only that same broken circle symbol from the envelope. The janitor reached into his pocket, withdrew a small brass key, and handed it to the man. You open it, he said. The man hesitated. What's inside? He asked, though his voice was barely louder than a breath. The janitor's crooked hands folded together, and he simply replied, what you need to see. With a shaking hand, the man fit the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down. Faint light spilled up from below, soft and golden, casting strange shadows along the walls. The janitor motioned him forward, but did not follow. This is your step, the janitor said, his eyes suddenly solemn. Mine was long ago. The man swallowed hard, clutched the envelope tighter, and began to descend. The staircase wound downward longer than it seemed it should. The air grew warmer as he went, and the faint golden light deepened into something richer, like the color of honey at dusk. When he finally reached the bottom, he stepped into a wide, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, each shelf stacked with hundreds of envelopes just like the one he held, some old and yellowed, some new and crisp. In the center of the room was a wooden bench and a small table. On the table was a single candle, its flame steady, its light spilling over the envelopes like a quiet blessing. He sat on the bench and placed the envelope on the table. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Finally, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. At first, there were only 2 words written in the center of the page. Your story blinked, confused. Then he noticed the faintest lines beneath. Those words, lines of handwriting that at first seemed invisible, but slowly began to darken as he looked closer, and then he realized they were his words, his failures, his regrets, his fears, his hopes, written out as though someone had pulled them directly from his heart. He read about the day he lost his job and sat in his car for hours, too ashamed to tell anyone. About the nights he watched his son sleep in the hospital and wondered if he was strong enough to keep going. About the quiet wish he'd buried deep inside, that someone would see him, really see him, and tell him he was more than his mistakes. Each line was written with painful, beautiful clarity. Each word felt like both a wound and a balm. And at the very bottom of the page, in new handwriting, not his, was a final sentence. The ending is not written yet. It is yours to choose. His chest tightened. His hands shook as he folded the paper back into the envelope. When he looked up, he saw the janitor standing at the top of the stairs, watching. The man stood, clutching the envelope to his chest, and slowly climbed back up when he emerged into the quiet corner of the terminal. Again, the janitor was still there, waiting patiently. The man handed the key back. What is this place? He asked, his voice raw but steadier now. The janitor gave the faintest smile. It's where you come when you're ready to stop believing what they told you, he said. The man nodded, his throat too tight for words. The janitor reached out and squeezed his shoulder gently with his crooked fingers. And now, he murmured, you know what to do. Just then, another announcement blared overhead, breaking the quiet. The man turned his head for just a second, but when he looked back, the janitor was gone. Vanished. All that remained was the faint scent of dust and candle wax, and the envelope still clutched in his hands. And as he stood there alone, the noise of the terminal rushing back around him, he realized something strange. He no longer felt afraid, but as he turned toward the exit, ready to step back into his life, he caught sight of a figure in the distance, tall, familiar, with a backpack slung over his shoulder, watching him from the other side of the terminal. It was Sundar, and this time, Sundar was the one who nodded first. The next chapter. Man stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, the noise of rushing travelers and boarding calls swirling around him like a storm. Yet through the crowd, Sundar remained perfectly still, watching him from the far side of the hall. His figure was partially hidden by a pillar, but his gaze was unmistakable, steady, calm, and strangely warm. The man felt the weight of the envelope still clutched in his hands, the words from the hidden room echoing in his mind. The ending is not written yet. It is yours to choose. Something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in so long, he almost didn't recognize it. Courage. He took a breath, then began to walk. The space between them felt impossibly long at first, but with each step, it grew shorter. People passed between them, a mother pulling her child, a businessman checking his watch, a young couple laughing softly, but the man never broke his gaze from Sundar's. Finally, They stood face to face again. Sundar spoke first. His voice quiet but carrying clearly over the hum of the terminal. "You went down there," he said, not as a question but as a certainty. The man nodded. Double quotes. "Yes," he replied, his own voice steadier now. I saw it. All of it." Sundar tilted his head slightly, as if examining him, not judging, but measuring, searching for something. Then, after a long pause, he said, "And," the man swallowed, "and I realized," he said slowly, "that I have been carrying my failures like a sentence instead of a lesson. I thought they meant I wasn't enough. But down there, I saw they were just the beginning." Sundar's lips curved, not into the faint, polite smile he had worn on the plane, but into something deeper, almost proud. "Good," he said softly. "Then you're ready." The man frowned faintly. "Ready for what?" he asked. Sundar motioned for him to follow.